Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. I'm back to discussing Palestine. And as I record this program, the Zionist entity has already violated the ceasefire 80 times, according to Al Jazeera, citing Gaza's government media office. These violations have killed at least 97 Palestinians and wounded 230. Commentary in the Zionist entity's media outlets suggests that the ceasefire could break down in the second phase on the issue of Hamas's disarmament. For now, Trump and his team have told Benjamin Netanyahu that the war is over. But which war is over? That's an important question. Trump's so-called peace plan focuses on Gaza, but the Palestine issue is not just about Gaza, even though, of course, the genocidal policies in Gaza have laid bare for the entire world the darkness that resides in the very idea of Zionism. But then there's the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. This is an area dotted with illegal Israeli settlements. Back in 1978, the US State Department legal advisor Herbert Hansel had determined that Zionist settlements contravened the Fourth Geneva Convention and were therefore inconsistent with international law. That legal advice was upended by the Trump administration in Trump's last tenure. Trump's then ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, was an Orthodox Jew, and by the way, whose daughter made Aliyah while he was the US ambassador, and his Secretary of State, as in Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, wanted Israel to fully annex the OPTs, which is the occupied Palestinian territories, without any concession to the Palestinians. Okay, great. So was someone else opposing this? His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Kushner's friend Berkowitz were really more generous, frankly, and they insisted that Israel's annexation could only happen as part of the condition laid down in the plan itself. Now, that's really generous, as I said. So the real issue is between hard and soft annexation. The plan, this particular plan, has no granular specificities or timelines. It doesn't address occupation, illegal settlements, pre-67 borders, right of return, economic strangulation of the Palestinians, rights to water, freedom of movement, and a host of other issues. But let me get to my guest for this episode, Dr. Mehran Kamrava. Kamrava is professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar and also directs the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He's the author and editor of several books, and his work has also appeared in peer-reviewed journals. We shall, of course, give the full list in the link below. For our present purpose, I will refer to his 2016 book, The Impossibility of Palestine, History, Geography, and the Road Ahead. So, Mehran, thank you so much for being on the program. I was really looking forward to this. You and I had a great conversation on another book of yours, which came out in 2018, Inside the Arab State, when you were physically in Lahore. And I have very fond memories of our interaction then. And then again, recently you were in Lahore, so we had a great evening together. But before I move further, I just want to give out some excerpts which I pulled out of your book. Before we have a deep dive into this. So let me give these excerpts from Professor Kamrava's book. So firstly, he says, I argue here that a confluence of developments and dynamics, both endogenous to Israel and Palestine and exogenous to the conflict between them, have rendered the establishment of a meaningful, viable Palestinian state impossible. But then he also makes another very interesting point. He says, Palestine's endurance as a nation is not in doubt. What I question is the possibility of a Palestinian state. It is on this issue, namely the growing non contiguity of the West Bank because of Israeli settlements, that most existing conclusions of Palestine's lack of viability are based. By enforcing law and order and running much needed services in the small A area it controls, and he's referring to the Palestinian National Authority, the PNA soon emerged as little more than Israel's subcontractor, a small time administrative machinery designed to make the occupation more effective and more efficient and presumably more enduring. And then, once again, to our present purpose, even the 2014 motions by parliaments in Europe, in Sweden, Britain, Ireland, Spain, and France, to recognize Palestine as a state as symbolically important as they may be, are void of substance and meaningful consequence. In reality, I argue here, these very negotiations and whatever state building they have fostered on the Palestinian side have directly undermined prospects for the emergence of a viable, functioning Palestinian state. And then, of course, the gradual transition from ethnic cleansing to separation was translated into official state policy by the early 1990s, by which time Israel and Israeli identity, that's what I call the Zionist entity, had long become irreversible, well-secured historical realities. And then, so this is not a story of Palestine as a failed nation. This is a story of Palestine as a failed state. We'll have more occasion to refer to Professor Kamrava's book, but let's start with the obvious. So we are talking about a book which is now 9 years old. So a lot of water has flown down the Jordan River. And in the last 2 years, we've seen the genocide. We now have this peace plan, which, as far from where I stand, is neither about peace per se, nor exactly is a plan. More about a ceasefire in Gaza, doesn't address any. So let's begin with the obvious. With this plan, what do you think is right about it, if at all, in terms of peace? And where do you think it sorely lacks when juxtaposed with history and many other structural factors?
Thank you. First, Ejaz, let me express a sincere word of gratitude for having me on your podcast. It's a delight and an honor being here. And as you mentioned, I had the pleasure of meeting you in person twice now in Lahore, and I value our friendship and your intellectual contributions to multiple conversations. So thank you very much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure being here. I wish it were under happier circumstances, because as you mentioned, what is transpiring today in Palestine is, unfortunately, for the time being at least, an unending genocide, despite the fact that much of the media in the West is celebrating supposed ceasefire and somewhat of a peace plan, which, as you rightly pointed to, doesn't really exist. So going back to your question, what is it? What is the peace plan? This latest plan premised on? Well, or what is good about it, and what is not good about it? We are now 2 years into a bloody, brutal genocide that has left behind more than 67,000 Palestinians. More than a year ago, an article came out in the British journal Lancet, the medical journal, which said that the actual number of Palestinians that have been killed is in excess of 100,000. I think it was 115,000 at the time. And that's about a year ago. To be exact, I think 11 months ago now. And so untold numbers of Palestinians have been killed, and anyone who's lost a loved one can remind us that the pain lingers for years, for decades. I lost my brother 5 years ago, every time I think about him, I tear up. And you can just imagine, multiply that by 67,000. And my brother passed away from natural causes. No one killed him. No one was responsible for killing him. And you can imagine the anger. And so what we're seeing is an unending national misery, a process of an unfathomable level of misery that, at least in our lifetimes, hasn't occurred. And it is ironic that the victims, the children of victims of the Holocaust, are engaging in their own genocide now in the 21st century. So any process, 2 years too late, but anything that ends the genocide is a positive development. But as you rightly also mentioned, what we're seeing in Palestine, Israel, is not necessarily a plan, but in many ways, a face-saving way for Netanyahu to salvage whatever international credibility Israel has left, to kind of appease people like Trump. Of course, it's a separate discussion, but we've had countries like Germany and Biden's America being proactively involved in the genocide. And so what we see is really a half-hearted effort on the part of Netanyahu and the United States to kind of have some sort of a peace so they can move on with their fanciful plans of either turning over the administration of Gaza to the likes of Tony Blair, or even more fancifully turning Gaza into some sort of Riviera of the Middle East. Already, incidentally, Ejaz, that there have been tweets by American members of Congress that have said, turn the place into glass, meaning bomb it so that the heat is so much that the concrete turns into glass, referring to nuclear weapons indirectly. So we continue to be at a critical juncture. Maybe the mass killings are not at the extent that they have been over the last 2 years, but since the ceasefire was announced, no less than 100 Palestinians, 97 Palestinians as of a few hours ago had died as of early this morning. And I haven't followed the news since this morning to see if any more Palestinians have been killed by Israel. But there's nothing really to celebrate yet.
So what you're basically saying is that on the plus side, the only thing that can be celebrated is the fact that there is a ceasefire, even though that's been violated, as I said in my opening, 80 times. And it's been reported by Al Jazeera, 97 Palestinians martyred and over 200 wounded. So here's the thing, going back to what you wrote in 2016, and you talked about the historical irreversibility of the Zionist entity. But you also mention, and this is a motif that you have in your book, with reference to the resilience of the Palestinian nation and its collective memory, its culture, its language, its various other iconography and so on. Now, in the last 2 years, what we have seen is that if you were to withdraw the US support, in theory, from the Zionist entity, it's straight up in the doghouse. It's a pariah state. It's a completely pariah state. As a matter of fact, just before I began talking to you, and I pulled this up, let me just, So in New York, Orthodox Jews have congregated to denounce the Israeli occupation army as anti Semitic and worse than Haman. I mean, Haman being that ancient Persian noble who plotted to annihilate the Jews according to the biblical book of Esther. And so it seems to me that, and these are Jewish voices. And there was a video on the social media of this congregation, and it's quite massive. So I'm just saying that, do you think that we now have enough evidence to suggest that the tide, and it's not going to turn overnight, that the tide may just be turning against the Zionist entity over the coming few years?
Absolutely. So what we have had historically, at least since 1948, is this assumption on the part of Israelis inside Israel and on the part of supporters of Israel outside of Israel's borders that Israel is an exceptional country. And as an exceptional country, it can do no wrong. So the normal rules of human behavior don't apply to it because it was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And as an exceptional country, this is a country that was born out of the guilt of the Europeans, born out of the unspeakable crime of the Europeans. And therefore, whatever it does historically is right and justified. And so we have an application historically to Israel of an exceptional set of rules that don't apply to other countries or to others. So if Israel goes around and kills somebody, it's seen as a heroic act of kind of national defense, and Israeli commandos are celebrated and movies are made about them, and they become folk heroes. But if somebody else does that, they're terrorists and they're guilty of crimes against humanity. And we've seen that this kind of duality and hypocrisy applied to Palestinians and to Israelis again and again and again historically. And what has happened over the last 2 years is that this sense of Israeli exceptionalism and that the normal rules of human behavior don't apply to Israel, that is beginning to change. And many people outside of Israel in particular are beginning to finally ask questions and say, wait a minute, this is not normal behavior. This is not national defense when you kill tens of thousands of children and say, well, you're after eliminating Hamas. This is just abnormal, regardless of whatever criteria or standards you're going to apply, regardless of the historical guilt that colors the lenses through which you might see these actions. If you're European, French, German, British, whatever, even American. And so what we are seeing is, as you say, the tide is turning, and finally people are saying, wait a minute, enough of this hypocrisy of applying a different set of rules to Israeli behavior that absolves them of what others are seen as guilty of.
Right. But here's the thing, Mehran, which is not just disappointing, but also deeply disconcerting. And that is that even as there is now a groundswell of opinion among the Western societies, and I'm using it loosely. I mean, I'm including people in Oceania and elsewhere, but the Muslim states or the Muslim majority states have so far, even after the illegal and brazen airstrike in Doha, when there was this congregation of about 60 Muslim majority states, including the GCC, Arab League, and the OIC, the response was totally lackluster. The two Gulf states that have who are part of the Abraham Accords, are not prepared to even downgrade relations with the Zionist entity. Now, with this international stabilization force, which frankly, we are told that Steve Witkoff is probably going to go to the UN Security Council and try and get a resolution and a UN mandate for this international stabilization force. Indonesia has talked about sending troops. Turkey has also said they will send troops. I don't know whether the Zionist entity will accept the Turkey troops. But Azerbaijan, which is very friendly with the Zionist entity, has also said that it will send troops. And I believe probably the Zionist entity, given the relations with Baku, will be fairly happy to have them. But in all of this, conspicuous by their absence are the Palestinians, both the Gazans as well as Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. So my question to you is that while the street in the Muslim majority states across the board is absolutely clear about how their states should approach the Zionist entity, but for instance, the Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, their primary bugbears or threats, if you will, are Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, the possibility of Arab Spring, which is another book that you and I debated, your 2018 book, Inside the Arab State, where the entire spring became the false dawn. So they're not concerned about Gaza or how many children have been martyred. They're concerned about perpetuating their dynastic rule. They're concerned about the threat from Iran. They're concerned about the emergence of Muslim Brotherhood. Where do you think this will go? Because these are historical trends and trajectories. And I know extrapolating from current trend lines into the future is not always, recommended. But one can perhaps try and see where things are headed. I just want to get your view on this.
Ejaz, you point to a very tragic but accurate historical fact. We all know the Kurdish proverb that the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. The Palestinians don't even have mountains as friends. As we've seen, Gaza is flatland, although the West Bank is hilly. But the Palestinians have historically had no friends. And even those who claim to lead the mantle of the Palestinian cause have all too often done so for their own political purposes, whether it is Nasser of Egypt or Gaddafi of Libya or Khomeini and Khamenei of Iran. They've done so for their own political purposes at home.
Sorry, just for the viewers, I'll strongly recommend Professor Kamrava's book that we're using as a pack, because all that he's saying here is part of the content of the book, where he talks about the history and the rest of it. So yeah, please carry on. But I just wanted to sort of underline this.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. But what we have really is, unfortunately, repeatedly, Palestinians since 1948 have been left out of the fate of Palestine. And when Palestinian leaders have been intimately involved, historical record shows that they've done so in order to save their own hide. And they've done so for their own political purposes. And we have the biggest sellout, Ejaz, by far, in 1995, which was the signing of the Oslo Accord, where we have the trappings of a state. And Arafat becomes really preoccupied with, for example, a presidential guard and how do foreign dignitaries get received and the pomp and circumstance, but almost completely ignores actual conditions on the ground. And in 1996, Arafat and company signed something that often we don't talk about, which is known as the Paris Economic Protocol, that effectively turns over to Israel control of Palestinian economy. And that is when the shekel, the Israeli currency, becomes, for all intents and purposes, the currency of trade in Palestinian territories. And that's when Israel gains control over customs duties of goods going in and out of Palestine. And so what we see historically is whenever there was a killing or whenever Israelis got upset for whatever reason, they would withhold customs duties, Palestinian customs duties. And that seriously hurt many Palestinians. And so unfortunately, the Palestinians have been repeatedly wronged, either by non-Palestinians who've claimed the Palestinian mantle, or by their own leadership, who have been much more animated by their own more immediate interests rather than by the greater good of the Palestinian people.
Absolutely. I'm so happy that you talked about this. This is what Edward Said, when he wrote in the London Book of Reviews, called the Palestinian Versailles. And, the very fact that Arafat did not even speak English with any degree of proficiency. And I still remember that clip, which was kind of, at one level, if it weren't so tragic, it would be very hilarious, where he was going to say, I renounce terrorism, and actually, instead of that, said, I announce terrorism. And the man sitting next to him sort of elbowed him and said, no, it's not announced, it's renounced. So, but this is also a very good, point at which I want to refer to your book and read out some excerpts before we proceed with this discussion, because I think those 3 points that you have mentioned in your book with reference to the Palestinian Authority and how Oslo agreements actually basically buried the idea of a Palestinian state. But let me just read out. So you're saying, first, the return of a small number of Fatah-affiliated middle-class entrepreneurs and their organic links with the newly established Palestinian National Authority transformed the Palestinian nationalist middle classes, once the mainstay of the liberation movement, to comprador bourgeoisie, highly supportive of the status quo and a force for conservatism. The second point that you make is that many of the civil society organizations that had grown spontaneously during the course of the Intifada gave way to non-governmental organizations whose primary focus became maintaining their funding streams, often from the United States and the European Union, and providing employment for urban professionals instead of addressing community needs. So you call it the NGOization of Palestinian society, helped blunt its penchant for resistance to Israeli occupation. And third, with the formal end of the national liberation movement, the failure of the promises of Oslo, and the growing chasm between religious and secularist political trends represented by Hamas and Fatah, respectively, there was a steady loosening up of social commitments in the West Bank and Gaza societies. The national sense of common purpose that once united Palestinian society was now steadily replaced with more parochial concerns and loyalties and so on, which I think those are really very insightful points. There was a joke when this whole thing started. I was talking to a Palestinian friend, and he said the joke in the occupied Palestinian territories is that a young man goes to the PNA, he's applied for a job, and so there is, after the interview and everything, the interviewer asks him, have you ever done anything which is against the interests of the Palestinians? Or have you ever been employed? So he says, no, sir, this is the first time I'm applying for such a job. So the Palestinian Authority has essentially been the quislings, the collaborators with the Zionist entity. Do you think that what has happened in Gaza, and we keep forgetting that what happened on October 7th was preceded in the occupied Palestinian territories over the last 2 years, in 2021 and 2022, the highest numbers of killings, demolition of property, destruction of properties, illegal settlements, and the rest of it. You've done field work for your book in the West Bank. Tell us the nature of these Bantustans and the control under the Oslo Agreement, Area A, B, C. How does it feel to be a Palestinian going from point A to point B?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and thank you for bringing it up, because oftentimes outside of the area, we have these notions of Palestinian territory and Israeli territory, and a lot of these well-meaning, good-hearted Western liberals talk about a two-state solution as if we're talking about actual entities that make sense, until you kind of go and see conditions on the ground and realize that these settlements are positioned very cleverly and deliberately in a way as to deliberately truncate Palestinian territories from one another. And so if you look at where the settlements are placed, first and foremost, they're spread on the edges of the West Bank. I mean, there are settlements elsewhere, but very strategically. So the West Bank is kind of hived off from the rest of Palestine proper, the Palestine that existed prior to 1948. And then cities are divided from one another. And so what would take, for example, 48 minutes or 45 minutes to go by car as a straight line, go from one point to another, now takes 2.5, 3 hours, and is through these zigzag roads punctuated by Israeli checkpoints. And these checkpoints are actually quite dehumanizing, because oftentimes what the checkpoints have is, yes, you can go through cars, but you've got to get out of your bus, and you've got to go through these what are called cattle doors. These doors literally for animals, for cattle, that kind of you go one at a time, and there are these bars in front of you, and you go through, and there's a kiosk where behind the bulletproof window an Israeli soldier is sitting, and you hand them your papers, and then if he or she approves it, then you go. And so, as you mentioned, I did a lot of field work, and deliberately I would go, although as an American passport holder, I didn't have to go through this, but a number of times I went through this process just to see how the average Palestinian felt. And as you mentioned, this is back in 2015, long before genocide. And so, this is now exactly 10 years ago when I would go. And then if you go also by a bus, what happens is everybody has to get off the bus and line up, everybody, and then the Palestinian soldier used to come and get everybody's papers. And I never forget, Ejaz, I was standing next to this young woman who was young and kind of quite attractive, and the disgusting look that the Israeli soldier gave her, and kind of the harassing look, and there was nothing she could say. She couldn't even look at him, like kind of give him a dirty look. She looked at the ground, and as an outside academic, as an observer, I was disgusted, I was angered. But imagine if I were her father. Imagine if I were her brother or sister or mother, or or anyone. And it was just incredibly dehumanizing to go through this process every single day, multiple times, when you go from point A to point B, being subject to this dehumanizing factor. And again, this is 10 years ago,
Yeah.
when there's none of this. What is happening today was happening. So, and if I may just share with you one more episode that I experienced. Initially, when I went to the West Bank, I went with a former Israeli soldier who had then turned into a peace activist. But he was a former Israeli soldier, card carrying, full-blooded Israeli. And he and I got inside a car with a driver, and the three of us drove, and we went to the outskirts of a settlement. And before we knew it, we were surrounded by Israeli security guards, private security guards, machine gun carrying security guards. And he was able to talk our way out of, and he just said, look, this is a professor that has come. I just wanted to show him the facilities because, for example, the settlements look like they look like little Americana. They look like any American suburb. They have green areas, they have sidewalks, they have places for leisure, congregation. They're beautiful and they're all contained cities. So they have their own schools and they have gated community. They're like massive gated communities. And then so once that was done and he was able to kind of talk our way out and we got back in the car, I noticed, Ejaz, this former Israeli soldier was ashen. He was sweating. He was worried. And he wouldn't tell me what had transpired and what they had told him. But he told the driver, he said, as fast as you can, get out of here. And I didn't realize the kind of the danger we had been in unintentionally at the moment. But here was a former Israeli soldier, full-blooded Israeli, that was literally run out of one of these settlements. And imagine if he had been someone looking like me or you, or someone, a Palestinian, or what. And that is the nature of these settlements. They are basically armed encampments. They're not just kind of hunky-dory suburbia that everybody kind of sits there. They're gun-carrying regular citizens that kind of can shoot someone like me or you with complete immunity. There are guards. These guards, I don't know what they had eaten. They were massive, with biceps bigger than my head, and they looked intimidating. They had intimidating weapons, and they even scared the former Israeli soldier who was kind of showing me around. And and that's just one episode, again, of an outsider kind of going in and studying. And I always knew that at some level, my American passport would protect me. Even if I was incarcerated, I would, I had the number of the American embassy at the time. I could call them or, demand some sort of protection. But imagine people who don't have that protection. And just, if I may, one more point. In these areas, and I being in a hot place like Pakistan, you would appreciate this. I noticed when we went to the settlements, the water tanks that were on the roofs were all white. And then we would go to Palestinian areas, and the water tanks that are on the roofs, and I was there during the summer, they were all black.
Yeah.
And this is yet another way of distinguishing. I mean, there are multiple ways whereby apartheid system distinguishes between the people who are in and the people who are out. But one of the systems is that in the heat of the summer, the water tanks of the Israelis is white and the Palestinians is black. And when I pointed this out for the local residents, this was just a fact of life. They hadn't even they said, look, oh yeah, how funny that you should mention this. We've got so many other problems and so many other concerns we hadn't even noticed. So that's the kind of reality with which Palestinian lives take place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is like what Professor Ashil Mabembe wrote that essay, Necropolitics. I mean, this is that Foucauldian thing where you control the bodies, and like Weizmann, who does this forensic architecture, has talked about the verticality of this apartheid. There's so many things that one can talk about. Israeli organizations themselves, Mahsoum Watch, that looks at these checkpoints, Bethlehem, that has been talking about these settlements, and which recently came out with a report saying that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And yet, uh, a lot of these Western governments still talk about a two-state solution. I mean, obviously, that is something which is a chimera, and that's not going to happen. But moving forward, since we are also running out of time, if you put all these pieces together in terms of what has happened in Gaza, in terms of how it has shaken the collective consciousness of, if not the Western governments, then at least the Western societies across the world, the fact that Netanyahu is essentially now someone accused of war crimes, is a warrant out for him. There is a case in the International Court of Justice with reference to genocide, all of this. And despite the pusillanimity of the Muslim majority states, well, I can't find a better word than that, frankly, for what is happening here. Do you think, given what you wrote in 2016 about the unviability or the impossibility of Palestine, do you think things have changed and that there is likely to be a movement towards a single state, some kind of South African style, change of circumstances on the ground enough for most of these settlers who actually dual American citizens and who've come from the United States and settled in the last 10, 12 years, the biggest number of settlers, illegal settlers, these neo-Zionists, have actually come from the United States, according to lots of research. Do you think that there is a possibility that things have actually begun to shift, even though at a huge cost to the Palestinians, towards some kind of resolution of this?
Yeah, and this is a good way of looking forward. So obviously, there's been a struggle for liberation since 1948. And the struggle for liberation has only resulted in the steady and increasing dismemberment of Palestine and the dispersion of Palestinians across the world. And in fact, in my class today, I was just telling someone, first the Palestinians were kicked out of Israel, and they got into, many of them went to Jordan, and then they were kicked out of Jordan in 1970, and they went into Lebanon, and then in 1982 they were kicked out of Lebanon. Of course, many of them stayed. I'm talking about Palestinian leadership, and then they went to Tunisia, and then they were kicked out of Tunisia, and they're all around the world. And I never forget, at the time I was reading one of these Palestinian leaders who they had in one of the Palestinian congresses in Tunisia. He said, he got up and said, look, enough about celebrating our victories and our struggles, because I'm worried that next year we're going to be celebrating even further from Palestinian heartland. We're going to be celebrating somewhere in the southern African southern African continent, and so obviously, what the kind of the struggle for liberation has only resulted in successive defeats, no matter how we package it, no matter how heroic, and it has been heroic, no matter how we look at it, it hasn't served the Palestinians, and it has only pushed the Palestinian national aspiration further and further away from realization. And so the conception that our generation has had of liberation is decidedly different than the conception of liberation that Palestinians in Palestine have. I never forget, Ejaz, a conversation I had with a Palestinian activist inside Ramallah. And he told me something that really struck a chord. He said, look, I tell the Israelis, okay, you took my land, you took my home, you took my flag, you took my country. Now give me health care. And that, this yearning for human dignity, this yearning to be able to live in a way that you support your partner, your spouse, your children, your parents, your extended family, and that you're able to live in dignity from day to day, that when you go from point A to point B, some 18-year-old with a gun won't give you a dirty look and you can't say anything in return, that you don't have to go through these cattle doors every day in order to go eke out a living. That is the new definition of liberation. That is what defines Palestinian struggle. And that realization, that victory, when we see it that way, may not come true in my lifetime or your lifetime. But as you mentioned earlier, we're already beginning to see the global tide turning. We're beginning to see that even in Germany, even Germans who are now treating the Palestinians as subhuman, even Germans are protesting against the genocide. Germans whose government has been proactively involved and supportive of the genocide, they're protesting. The Swedes are protesting. The Brits are protesting. The Americans are protesting. And so, although the protests of a year ago might no longer be as massive and as evocative as they once were, the assumptions are beginning to change. And as I mentioned earlier, our perception of Israel as an exceptional country that can do no wrong, that has begun to change. And so the current situation is untenable. Ethnic cleansing, I talk in my book about legal ethnic cleansing, that didn't work. As one Palestinian activist in Bethlehem told me, he said, look, they've put us in human warehouses. That hasn't worked. That's not going to work. So apartheid hasn't worked. Ethnic cleansing hasn't worked. Genocide hasn't worked. It ultimately killed 67,000 Palestinians, but there's still 1.5 million, more than 1.5 million of the Palestinians in Gaza. Genocide only exposed Israel for what it is, for the genocidal government that it is. And that didn't work. And so looking down the line, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, maybe not in our lifetime, but certainly in my children and my children's children's lifetime, we're going to see a different geography. This is untenable. This human suffering at this scale, at this level, in this form is untenable. Apartheid in South Africa ended eventually after decades of struggle. It ended. Apartheid and ethnic cleansing and this God is my real estate agent, therefore this land belongs to me, that is not going to last historically. That is bound to change.
Absolutely. I think it'll be sooner than that. But there are a number of factors, and obviously, Al-Alim is only Allah's, He's al-alim. We can't look into the future, but the fact is that there are these trend lines that indicate that a lot has changed. But before I close the program, Mehran, thank you so much. The couple of things that I want to leave for the viewers. This was David Friedman I talked about, who was an Orthodox Jew and former U.S. ambassador to the Zionist entity. On Trinity Broadcasting Network, he was interviewing Mike Pence, who's the former U.S. vice president. And Pence said this, and I'm quoting directly from what he said. He said, one of the historic errors the U.S. made, going back to the Carter administration, was the fiction of being an honest broker. I think what President Trump understood, and he's talking about the previous tenure of Trump, was if the world knows nothing else, the world needs to know this, that America stands with Israel. And let me also quote Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who was speaking to heads of Jewish organizations in New York on 27th March 2018. And he said, in the last several decades, the Palestinian leadership has missed one opportunity after the other. It is about time the Palestinians take the proposals and agree to come to the negotiations table, or shut up and stop complaining. And incidentally, this is when the Saudis were presenting these proposals, and the Gulf partners also, about non-annexation of the West Bank, something that Netanyahu completely rejected at that time. But that's a long story. Then Sheikh Abdullah bin Ahmed Al Khalifa was undersecretary at Bahrain's foreign ministry. He was speaking at the Munich Security Conference, said, and again, direct quote, there is intelligence cooperation between Bahrain and Israel. Mossad is in Bahrain, and they are present in the region. Intelligence cooperation is part of our ongoing partnership between Bahrain and Israel and will continue. And finally, in January 2024, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of the Zionist entity, at a nationally televised conference said, in any future arrangement, Israel needs security control over all territory west of the Jordan. This collides with the idea of sovereignty for Palestinians. What can you do? This truth I tell to our American friends, and I put the brakes on the attempt to coerce us to a reality that would endanger the state of Israel. So that's where things stand, and so you have to juxtapose what's going on here with other trend lines. But as I said, thank you so much, Mehran, for your insights. I am really grateful that you took time out for this. This is all for this episode. I hope you will send us comments. It helps us to improve what we can do. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.